So
Okay.
welcome you guys to World Affairs Wednesday. Today we have Sam Kessler, who has spoken to us before about some military and geostrategic issues. He is a writer, analyst, and consultant who writes on global security, geopolitics, and business and finance issues for clients, businesses, and various publications. He has contributed articles to Asian Affairs Magazine, Overture Global, NASE, Fulcrum Global, as well as on his professional website and blog, www.samkessler.com. He's also the geopolitical advisor for North Star Support Group and contributes analytical articles for them bi-monthly. I will boast that Sam, who will be tuning back in hopefully shortly, is an alum of Bradley University. So he was one of my students back in the day. He has a bachelor's in international studies and a minor in economics. And he also has a master's from the national security studies, rather, from American Military University, which is part of the American Public University system. So, he's coming right back in, and we'll get him going. Excuse me. Sam, are you ready to go?
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
I think that the system, they wanted to reboot or something. I'm not sure what happened, but
oh, you know, Zoom is trying to tell everybody that we have updates, and so sometimes it won't let you use Zoom until you download the updates. So, but you are set, and I've made you a co-host. If you'd like to share your slides, take us away.
Okay.
Just as a reminder, at the bottom of your image is a green button that says share screen.
Okay, now this finally showed up.
There you go.
Think it was a software issue, I think. That's why.
I gotcha. Okay. And we do see, if you want to click on your slide presentation, that will work. The presentation mode instead of the, there you go. Looks good. Take us away.
Thanks. Well, thank you. I apologize for the tech stuff. I was just actually on another Zoom, and we didn't have this tech issues, but there's always a different way to experience it in one way or another. But I want to first thank you for having me here, and it's third time I get to do one of these, so it's a real honor to do it. I don't know if Angela told you, but I actually went to Bradley, and I believe we have some Bradley students here. So if you have any questions about international affairs or anything about the topic or anything in general, I'm open to have a discussion with that. Just trying to move this over here. Okay. So first of all,
I already gave him your bio. Go ahead.
You can did?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, so let's get started then. Topic is going to be about the AUKUS agreement, regional impact in Indo-Pacific and current geopolitical situation. I'm sure you all have heard a lot of interesting events regarding this and the amount of urgency that's tied to it, and a lot of other issues. And these are things that have been discussed over the years. And so it's just interesting as someone who's been following it for a while to see how it evolves in the narrative format. And it tells you how the international system is evolving, but you always have to keep being adaptable and flexible and understanding how things are changing and what they mean so that we can make better decisions. And so with AUKUS, what is it? I mean, it's something that wasn't really brought up until last month in September, when you hear there's this new strategic defense alliance between Australia, the UK, and the US. And an agreement like this is something that usually, I mean, it could be a process that's been going on for 6 months. I would say it's more like 1 or 2 years. And there's a history behind it that I'll go over it. But first of all, what is AUKUS? Is first of all, the US, UK, and let's do it in order of AUKUS format. Australia, UK, and the US. There are 3 of the 5 members of what is considered the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, which the other 2 countries are New Zealand and Canada. And, you know, there's a reason why those 2 aren't part of this, and I'll be happy to go into that some more. But the US and Australia and the United Kingdom, they've had a very long history of working together in terms of military, defense, intelligence, foreign affairs, all aspects. So there's a very close relationship here. And one of the key themes of AUKUS is to work together and to basically well, it's not really a new buzzword, but it's being talked about, and more people are you know, in articles and other stuff, and they're talking about what's called interoperability, which they want to utilize as they work together in order to counter was the continued rise of China in the Indo-Pacific. Interoperability, when you think of it, is like you got to think in terms of how are these countries' militaries going to work together, from refueling to re-equipping to figuring out how to, you know, how to fire a cannon, you know, stuff like that. Do it all in sync, or you know, you have to develop a certain protocol, and every military has its own kinks, so you got to figure that out before the actual event happens, if it happens. And that's why you always hear the importance of military exercises, and you know, you hear a lot China and Russia doing exercises together. And so there's a lot of interesting, you know, data that these countries get from those experiences. They learn about themselves and the people they're doing the exercises, and the idea is to really improve the way they go about it. So with AUKUS, interoperability is they're still probably going to have to figure out new things, new ways to work together, but they already have a close relationship. So that's the beauty of having a long-term friendship and alliance structure through other ways. And so with AUKUS, in this case, they are sharing and developing nuclear power technology with Australia. The US hasn't done this in about, I think, 50 years, and it was the UK. And this is a very big deal because there's only 6 countries, I believe, that have nuclear powered subs, and Australia would be the 7th. So in this case, part of the deal is that Australia would get at least 8 nuclear powered submarines by 2040, if not earlier. Now, are they going to have nuclear powered submarines until 2040? It's very likely. They're not going to wait till 2040 just to get it. And the way things work is they can lease nuclear subs from the US or the UK, as well as both of those countries can house their subs at Australia, which is another strategic aspect of AUKUS because of the location. You know, I mean, people are focused on Afghanistan, and there is an issue about that because Afghanistan is, you know, right next to the Chinese border, and it's like it would remain as a primary US base in the region to deal with that. But if that's not the case, the US has to look elsewhere. And there are other places that the US is focusing on. And Australia, as a peer of mine pointed out, would be like a large aircraft carrier of sorts. So you have a strategic aspect of Australia, and you have a friend, and they're committed to the same process. And with Australia, the other part of the deal, which is one of the big aspects, is the sharing access of Tomahawk missiles, hypersonic missiles, which could provide long-range strike capability across air, land, and sea. And it would be utilized by the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy for a variety of issues. But there's supposedly, in this agreement, no nuclear warheads, which is possible because they have previously agreed that they would not have any. But from a strategic perspective, it also provides, you know, they may not need it, because if there's ever an attack, you can still use the Tomahawks for defense or for a strike capability. So that's another rabbit hole to go into for understanding. But in terms of the AUKUS agreement, the framework for cooperation, it's a cooperation agreement. It's a defense alliance, and they can share information and technology relating to cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and other technologies, as well as other non-related tech activities like intelligence or maybe foreign affairs, maybe commercial stuff too. But this area is probably, just as important as the submarines, if not more so, because right now the biggest issue is about who is going to, have greater competitive advantage in the tech side of things, and cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and machine learning technologies, and autonomous vehicles. That stuff is still being figured out in terms of how things are functioning. And at this point, at the big concern is going to be like, catching up with the investments that China has been doing over the years. So you have to think in terms of 5, 10, 15, and 20 years as how that impacts things. And, that's a very big debate going on. In fact, there was a recent interview by a former Pentagon software chief who, he just flat out said that he resigned because he was frustrated over the problems he was having to get his solutions resolved in terms of updating software and other capabilities to modernize. So that is a hurdle that the Pentagon is dealing with, and that's another pipeline to get into. But in terms of AUKUS, it's going to be very important because you're going to be working with the British and the Australians to tackle this as well. So you have that aspect, and that is, something to look at in terms of how they're going to operate collectively to have the same culture and the same protocols to make sure that, they don't have any hiccups in case there are, some serious scenarios down the road. So that was AUKUS. That was basically some basics about what AUKUS is. But let's look at a little bit about the history leading up to it. And I'm going to give like an Australia, UK perspective, because these are pretty big deals for them. And, there's, in regards to Australia, there's, I would say for the last year and a half to 2 years, you've really been seeing a heated debate by their political and media classes regarding the impact of China in their region. And you're hearing, you could go to Sky News and hear a whole lot of stuff, but you also hear it from their prime minister, and everyone is very concerned about what is happening. And, it was starting before COVID started, but it's really escalated more, and it's affected their trading relationship with Beijing. But it's, there's a lot of things to look at, and I've only outlined a couple things, but one was in terms of COVID, you have the push to investigate the origins of COVID-19 at the Wuhan lab. And, that's one aspect, and it's really increased the tensions between the two countries. With Wuhan, it's very significant because I know people who have been investigating Wuhan for several years. And, a friend of mine told me that it's really the equivalent to what DARPA, and I'm a small combination of DARPA and MIT. If you're not familiar with DARPA, it's the Defense Advanced Research arm of the Defense Department of DoD. So has a long track record of working with very strong, developing strong technologies, biological weapons, and all that. So there's a history. So there's a reason why Australia would push to investigate that. But to go forward, you also have an issue of the port deals. There's a lot of Chinese interest in Australia, and one is a 99-year port lease deal with a company called Landbridge, supposedly private, but a lot of private companies from mainland are usually have some form of control by the government. But the control of the port was considered a national security concern because it was near a military base. I believe it was a U.S. military base, but it probably means a Australian military as well. So when it comes to the ports, that ties in with a lot of other issues with ports that Chinese companies have significant advantage all around the world, which is part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And a 99-year port lease agreement is something that's being reviewed because ports can also be used for military purposes. And during times of peace, this wasn't taken to fully in assessment, but if tensions are higher, ports can easily be transitioned for naval purposes. So that's the reason why there's some concern there. So another one is the creation of Chinese cities and naval capabilities, infrastructure on islands near Australia, very short distance. Well, I believe it was in somewhere an island that's, I think the Dahu or Daru, I forget the name. They're looking to build, I think it was like a $30 billion city that is supposedly utilized for manufacturing, but also for naval purposes, which can easily be transitioned for military. And so if there's ever a conflict between the two, it would shorten the distance for naval ships to go from there to Australia. So that is an issue of maritime law that they're concerned. You have to look at it from that perspective. And things like that have impacted the trade relationship. And the French submarine deal is another aspect of the history going up to it. The issue of diesel versus nuclear is an issue where, nuclear submarines are a lot quicker and a lot quieter and can run on endless amount of energy without having to refuel. So you're dealing with that aspect, and the diesel sub deal would really counter their efforts to strengthen Australian security in the region. So that's another reason why. So on the UK front, you have Brexit. You have greater security and economic interests in the Indo-Pacific, Southeast Asia, which is going to be a primary focus going forward. It already is. So they have vested interests in the region, and there's a lot of interesting stories tied to that. Britain is also looking to redefine its role as a naval power and an international player in a system that is quickly evolving, and a system that's not only quickly evolving, but has more players with strength. So Britain is rediscovering its role, whatever that will be. But you also have their concern for Chinese expansionism in the region and other parts of the world impacting their interests and sphere of influence, the Belt and Road, and also in Africa, which is becoming a big issue of colonization from China to that part of the world. So you have those aspects leading up to the history. So with AUKUS, you also have a relationship regarding the Quad. And the Quad is a pretty big deal in that part of the world. If you look at the picture, you have 4 countries. You have US, Australia, India, and Japan. And you have China here, and you have the Pacific, and you have Taiwan is over here, Philippines, and Hong Kong, and all that. So, oh, and also this part of the area too. But anyway, that's a big sphere of influence by 4 countries. And of course, you have China in the center. You have a few other countries too, but that's the key point. So the Quad is an informal, is not really a formal alliance, but it serves as a strategic dialogue and other things between the US, Australia, India, Japan. Quad is a big issue. And in the recent years, since there's been an agreed shared concern of China's rise, there's been greater intensification of security and economic ties. And we're seeing, military exercises. They're going through those right now. It's been going on since, I believe, since August. And they're doing different types of maneuvers to test their interoperability capabilities so they can correlate with each other. And that is also tied to, that is where the AUKUS agreement comes in, where they're using it as an opportunity to start testing this new alliance together, but also means it's an opportunity for other countries like India, Japan, possibly even South Korea and Vietnam to develop a relationship, to further develop the relationship with AUKUS via the Quad and potentially as members of AUKUS at the same time. Time will tell with that, but that's something to look at going forward. There's other countries that might be interested too, but in terms of regional players, those are the ones that really come to mind at the moment. So this is the last slide on here. And I'm going over the China and Taiwan situation very quickly, and I'll try to get as much as I can without overloading. But in this case, the situation, we are seeing a lot more rhetoric and military maneuvers being executed by the Chinese military, flying planes over Taiwanese airspace or other type of entanglements, whether it's to test systems or to intimidate. There's a wide variety of reasons. You're still seeing a continued Navy and naval investment in the People's Liberation Army's Navy in terms of naval and amphibious operations capabilities. In fact, there was a they're in the process of negotiating purchases to upgrade their naval helicopters that can be used for possible landings and amphibious. And these are Russian helicopters that are made stronger to withstand a lot of potential conflict. But is it specifically meant to go into war immediately? Probably not, because of the the level of action and the limitation of the amount of helicopters. So it's probably used as a deterrence at the moment, but going forward, who knows? You're seeing a lot of, at this point, everyone knows that the US has a relationship with Taiwan and that they're required to defend Taiwan. And, that's the current agreement. And so, people have differing opinions after what happened in Afghanistan, but an agreement is an agreement, and it's a different scenario than what we saw there. So we have to put that into perspective. Also, you have to look at, what would a amphibious landing, from China onto Taiwan actually mean? Well, in the current capacity, it's estimated that it would be several hundreds of thousands of casualties before even making headway, onto the land. But then the other thing is, at this point, no one wants to create destroy Taiwan because it's a semiconductor capital of the region. It's like a Silicon Valley, but that could also be a threat too at the same time. But destruction of that would greatly impact a lot of countries, everyone basically, including China, because there's a major chip shortage. So, people, that's another concern to look at. That is one aspect. So before looking at, being concerned if there's going to be a war anytime soon, the tensions.
Hang on, before we go past Taiwan, let me ask a quick question from the chat. Dr. Kapanji asks a relevant question here. Do you think that the sorties that were flown over Taiwan were in response or retaliation, and rather for the AUKUS agreement? In the last week, China has been demonstrating its air power over Taiwan. Do you think that's a reaction to this new arrangement, or is it coincidental?
I think it's probably a reaction. It could have been maybe both, but there's been a lot of other things that have happened that indicate that they're doing more to retaliate. But if you listen to some of the rhetoric that they do on mainland, they're doing more to build up more concern over this. But they've been doing that for a long time already. So
yeah, they more or less dismissed the Quad, but now that the Quad is actually getting some teeth, maybe they're not going to dismiss it so easily.
Probably not. I think they want it nice and easy. So it's kind of if there's a little extra oomph, they're going to start retaliating because they've enjoyed not having much pushback. So it's.
And I'll throw in Bob Yonker's question as well before you get into the threat of war, which might scare all of us. But are there any recent or planned AUKUS military exercises for joint interoperability, sorry, not inoperability, but interoperability demonstrations or operations? Like the JWID, which I don't know what that is, but I bet you do.
Well, there's one going on right now, which is Quad related. And actually, I did a little interview last minute yesterday, and that is going on right now. That's going on right now and ending till the 15th off of the Bay of Bengal. And they're doing anti-submarine removal type of operations. So there's a relationship to that where they're already starting. So
okay.
Yeah.
All right, now you can scare us about war.
Okay. Well, it's not so much about war. It's it's really about what situations are affecting it. And before looking at the possibility of war, let's look at a few things. I think we have to look at the naval capabilities, training capacity. If you talk to anyone with a military background, they're going to say that the best soldiers and capabilities are the U.S. military. And for the most part, that's pretty accurate because there's a lot of training, a lot of research, and a lot of, years of figuring things out in a conventional and non-conventional capabilities. But the Chinese have done more non-conventional stuff than conventional, and that's become a very big bread and butter approach for them. So you have to look at it from that perspective. At this point, it would be they're not proven to the point that the U.S. has, and people say, well, the U.S. just left Afghanistan or the stuff in Iraq, but that's another story. But in terms of training and experience and capabilities and knowledge and how to utilize it, there's a lot of work that's gone into figuring it out. Now, the U.S. itself is in the process of trying to redesign itself in the way they fight future wars. And, from that capacity, it's not really ready to do a full-scale conflict, and neither are the Chinese, for that matter. That's the thing. I mean, the thing is, it could still happen, and we've seen that happen in history. If you go back to whether the Second War, or I like to go back to the First World War, you look at countries that, were not really equipped to really withstand the long-term impact of, a 4-year war, that to the extent that they did. You saw the end of empires because of that. Ottoman Empire, before that, they were really focusing on trying to, manage a declining empire while preserving what territory they had left. And they thought that joining the German alliance, it would be the best bet for them at the time. Obviously it wasn't, but at the time it seemed like it. So, and with the Russian and Chinese relationship, it's somewhat similar to that. But let's go back to the other stuff that I don't want to get into the Ottoman Empire at the moment. So with China, you have the training and the stuff. I mean, they're doing things, but to the extent that the U.S. or its allies have done, there's still a track record that is not fully proven. So they have to play it somewhat safe. And do they have the capacity for a long incursion? No, not really. Maybe at some point they will, but it's still an issue. That's why some people say they're a paper power, because of in terms of how much real hard power influence they have without much pushback. But that's reversing. So you have that aspect. But one aspect that I've been hearing over the years, but it's been getting more buzz lately, is their domestic situation in terms of debt issues and their housing bubble issues and the debt their local governments are having, and it's a pretty big issue. There's people who are saying that that their housing alone makes a very large portion of their GDP, and people don't invest in stocks or bonds; they invest in real estate to make money. But there's an issue where a lot of these companies, the development companies, they're not able to pay their debt. And then you have a lot of local governments that are in debt that can't pay either. So you have what's considered many trillions. I mean, I've seen people go from 5 trillion to 50 trillion. I mean, I'd have to do more work just to look at that. But when Goldman and Sachs makes a big point out of it, I'm going to pay more attention about it. But you have that as a possible scenario that can impact their decisions. Another is they're currently going through energy and food shortages because of the supply chain being disrupted, but also their issue with Australia has impacted them greatly because they get a lot. They've gotten a lot of coal. They rely on energy from Australia, but because of the whole COVID thing and the desire to investigate, that's been disrupted. So there's stories all over saying that there's street lights being out and there's factories without power, elevators without power. There's all sorts of things. And you also have issues of, there's been some really bad floods in terms of climate issues. There's been some major things that have disrupted their cities. So there's a lot of stuff going on there domestically, signs of growing unrest. I mean, usually you would hardly hear about it, but now it's coming out more, and there's more signs of that. But all of this is happening while the CCP has been upgrading their anti-Western policy or rhetoric, and they're showing signs of rooting out some Western influences. So what does that mean? Are they going through another cultural revolution of some sorts? I'm not sure, but I know one thing. There's people who are estimating that if there is a collapse of some sort, that China would fracture into maybe 3 or 4 segments. And so, I mean, that's something to look at. What exactly would that mean? What exactly does that mean for a country that has developed with technology and capabilities compared to, after the Second World War? You have to think a lot from that aspect. I mean, what does it mean for Taiwan too? Because the two have been, have this relationship over the years ever since it was formed. So those are some things to consider with AUKUS. I hope I didn't go overboard with this, but if you have any questions, I'll be happy to go a bit more deeper.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions in the chat, but we're a small group. So if you guys would like to unmute yourselves and talk to Sam yourself, that would be fine. I'm going to start with the 2 questions that are in the chat, or the 2 comments. Bob Yonker reports that China has over 96 ports in 60 nations, and the latest is in Israel at Haifa. Did the U.S. have any reaction to that port in Haifa?
I'm not. I remember visiting, or not visiting, but reading about that a while back. But I would say if they're concerned about that, they probably have. What's the word? I guess they probably communicated concerns, maybe privately.
Talked about it privately.
Yeah.
That's like a internal family issue or something. So.
Yeah.
Pam points out that looking at the Quad map, it would seem that there might be an opportunity to limit China's ability to conduct international trade with a blockade, especially if there are ongoing food shortage issues. Could we do that? And would it be an effective policy?
Well, I mean, that's what they're worried about. And because, the whole point, that's one thing where they're trying to find other routes for trade and access to energy and other things. And that's one of the reasons why you hear about the relationship with Pakistan. And I mean, in a sense, Pakistan has already become a client state in a sense because of the relationship there with the Gwadar port and the amount of technology. And in fact, they actually have a security force that is run by Chinese military with Pakistanis, which is geared towards protecting the relationship because Pakistan has a port which can lead to the Middle East, to Iran, which ties into that relationship. And it also, when you go to Afghanistan, it's also tied to Afghanistan as well, because Afghanistan not only is a buffer to China, but also is a buffer to Central Asia, to Europe, and everywhere. So it's a land route when you look at it from a geographical stance. So yeah, I think they're looking for other ways. And of course, there's the Russian relationship, but that's complicated to explain as well. But they're looking for all sorts of alternatives. They're also dabbling in renewable energy, with batteries and stuff too. But so we'll see.
Yeah, probably the world's leader is going to be the country who develops a long-lasting battery that can store wind and solar power for, a lot of wind and solar power. That's going to be the next global leader probably. Dr. Kopanji asks a question about North Korea. He says, North Korea has developed a supersonic missile that flies 5 times the speed of sound. Is this a source of concern for war?
I don't think a concern for a war, but it also depends on how things are managed too at the same time. I mean, if you look at the technical capabilities, it's still limiting, but, really doing these flybys, I guess I would call them, is a sign of, we still want this attention, so still pay attention to us at the moment. But I think you also have to determine, what the relationship with Beijing is, as well as with South Korea, and how the U.S. manages it. I mean, we didn't start seeing flybys again until very recently, after a bit of a lapse in it. But I guess I think time will tell. I don't think it's a big concern at the moment, but you never know. It depends on how these things get managed.
Does anybody have another question for him?
So there's been, well, this will be out in the left field a little bit. There's been a comparison of Hitler and I. Any comments towards that?
Well, like with she, is that
She, I'm sorry, I said that.
Okay,
She,
yeah.
she.
Well, I mean, there has been a comparison. I know what you're talking about. I think you look at the situation with the Uyghurs and the level of control in their society in that sense, and they call it totalitarianism, and there's and their treatment of people. There's been a lot of reference to that. I mean, I think there's a lot of validity as well, but it's like the issue is like, are you talking about the leadership or the people? And it's the leadership that people have issues with, and and I think with that approach, you also have to realize, how is that going to affect their decisions, their ability to innovate in the future, and what their hierarchies are. In that type of hierarchy, they don't promote outside or left field thinking. They don't promote the type of creativity and innovation that would be required. So it could be that the system is what ends up limiting their capabilities. And I mean, people talk about Chinese expansionism or great power competition. People are worried that they with the Belt and Road Initiative, and there's a lot of concern there. But I would also say is you have to look at their domestic situation at the same time. One thing to look at is what exactly is their ideology and their objectives. Well, the CCP wants to stay in power because they know if they lose it, they're going to be clobbered. And Xi himself has really doubled down on a lot of that. And he's done a lot of rhetoric, he's doubled down on the very anti-Western rhetoric, which we've seen a lot through history. He's really doubled down, and he's also dealing with his political situation because there are factions, and he's trying to take out a lot of his adversaries at the same time, who are going to question his leadership even more so. And I mentioned earlier about floods and I believe a quake too. The Chinese have something called the mandate of heaven, and they tie that to leadership in terms of, when it's time to bring in a new leader or to keep one. They look at natural calamities like floods and how it impact and poverty or hunger or stuff like that. So they're going to tie that, and their economy isn't doing so well in terms of growth. There's still a lot of question to that. So that stuff affects the way they, present themselves. And with fascism, I mean, you have a lot of issues. I mean, it's like with the treatment of people, and you have a policy of controlling everything. and there's growing unrest, and you have an potential economic disaster happening, it's going to create a lot of issues. So, trying to get back to what you're saying, I think you're going to find you have to look at how, in the current circumstance, how outward are they going to expand? When COVID first came out, I was talking to a friend of mine, and he was on the COVID action force, and he was putting together a lot of solutions, and we were piecing out or red teaming some aspects of, what exactly are there, if it's not about COVID, if it's not about the virus, is it about power? Is it about trying to develop a increased sphere of influence, or to preserve it? And, at this point, I think they're just trying to preserve it. I hope that helps.
Yeah, one bad thought would be, so if you need to maintain control and have unrest locally, then create an outward conflict to bring the people back in line, because now they have an adversary or a war.
It would be the first.
Yeah, so that's what I'm worried about. Anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, divert attention from your domestic problems. Yeah, unfortunately, a common tactic. Dr. Kapanji, did you have another question?
No, I don't think so. That's
Okay.
fine. Thank you very much.
I'll throw one other thing I found very interesting in the 60 Minutes episode on the semiconductor in Taiwan. And I hadn't thought of it, but they asked him, so are you the best national Taiwan defense? Because China relies on their chips too. And he said that China has tried and has not been successful in making their own chips yet. So that was just an interesting perspective I thought about. And also it's credence to what Sam just said about innovation and having the ability for people to do things. That kind of jives in there with it too. Of course, US and Intel didn't do much better, so that was driven by stock ownership. I don't want to spend billions of dollars, and now I should have, but different story. But I thought that was pretty interesting then, and they're gonna expand. So maybe Taiwan should. We should support Taiwan in that area. That would be another method of defense against the expansion. So
yeah, and that has been going on for a few years now. With regards to the China trying to perfect its chips, part of that is also they've been trying to buy semiconductor companies throughout the world, U.S. and European, and partly because there's with CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment or something along those lines with Congress, they've really done more to prevent the acquisitions of those companies abroad, and working with the other countries to agree with that as well. So that's a very big reason why they haven't fully adapted to or developed their semiconductor industry. It's actually very small, and that is pretty important. And there was a lot of attempts. For me, when I really followed that, I was looking at Qualcomm and Broadcom, and that was a big drama. I don't want to get into it. I wrote a long piece on that on my blog because I was following it religiously for 2 years. But it was, when that ended up becoming a CFIUS or a national security concern, because they decided that they would protect the companies, and because Qualcomm would be considered a pearl or a treasure in terms of semiconductor and all this other aspects. But Taiwan, I remember from a few years ago, we developed an agreement with Taiwan to develop a semiconductor plant here in the US too. So there's a lot of stuff happening. This stuff gets, they develop the deal, but it takes years for it to fully evolve. So, it'll be interesting to see where they're at now at this point.
I'm going to ask Pam's question as the last one. We've got students ready to come in this room. In your opinion, has the U.S. done enough, or what have we done to claw back critical manufacturing? So before we go to war with China, can we produce all the things that we depend on China for?
Well, I mean, we can, but it takes a lot of planning. And I know there are people who are having very big discussions about this. And again, it's a leadership issue. It's a design issue. I mean, there's people talking about quick fixes where they create infrastructure that has multiple uses or adaptabilities to make it a lot easier, to make it more agile or mobile. If they talk about, building ships, there's a lot of infrastructure that has to be upgraded, and there needs to be new shipyards, and you have to train new people because I think the average age of people in the shipbuilding is like, I think it's either in the late 50s or early 60s, something like that. And you really have to, there's a big national, there needs to be a big, design campaign. I don't know if we're really tackling at the moment to talk about the, readdressing manufacturing concerns. But I mean, companies are are in the process. I keep hearing stories where they're moving to India or Vietnam or elsewhere, but it's at this stage, I think you might see it at the private sector, but you need to, when they talk about national infrastructure, that has to be a bit of a priority. And I don't know if we're really addressing it. I haven't read any of these, documents that they're putting out, but it's an issue that I know people are having.
Well, thank you, Sam. This has been a good discussion. Again, we're a small group, but nonetheless, it'll be posted on YouTube so y'all can watch it later, and others will tune in and watch it later as well. But as always, Sam, you've given us a lot of information to think about and digest. For those of you interested, tomorrow night, we're going to talk to a couple of other Bradley students who are at Bradley now, who come to us from Rwanda. So it'll be an interesting conversation. I wanted to ask them about the genocide of 1994, and none of them were born yet. And so their perspectives are very, very different. So thank you, Sam. On behalf of the Peoria Area World Affairs Council, everybody have a terrific day. Stay safe.